My name is Henry. I've lived in this small coastal town my entire life where everyone knows everyone and secrets feel like they're written in the air for all to see. I'm 28, work at the local library. And until recently, I've kept the most essential part of myself hidden away, not just from others but sometimes even from myself. I grew up in a traditionally religious household. My parents weren't zealots, but Sunday service was non-negotiable, and the church community formed the backbone of our social life. As a child, I found comfort in the rituals, the familiar hymns, and the sense of belonging, but as I grew older and began to understand myself better, that comfort transformed into a complicated knot of guilt and fear. By my early 20s, I had stopped attending church regularly. I made excuses about work schedules and other commitments, but the truth was simpler and more difficult. I couldn't reconcile who I was with what I had been taught. My parents noticed, of course. There were gentle inquiries, invitations to special services, and occasional disappointed sighs when I declined, but they never pushed too hard, perhaps sensing there was something fragile at work that shouldn't be disturbed. Then 6 months ago, everything changed. My father had a heart attack. He survived, thankfully, but the experience shook our family to its core. In those frightening hours at the hospital waiting for news, I found myself praying for the first time in years. Not formal prayers from my childhood, but desperate pleading thoughts sent into whatever void might be listening. When my father stabilized, I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that he would live, and guilt that it had taken such a crisis to make me reach for faith again. The Sunday after he came home from the hospital, I surprised my parents by agreeing to attend service with them. My mother cried, attributing it to joy over my father's recovery. In part, she was right. The church had changed since my youth. The old priest, Father Matthews, had retired, and a new priest had taken his place. Father Noah was younger than I expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with an easy smile and eyes that seemed to hold genuine interest. When he greeted parishioners, he spoke with my parents for a few minutes after the service, inquiring about my father's health with what appeared to be sincere concern. When he turned to me, extending his hand, I felt an unexpected jolt of connection. "You must be the elusive son I've heard about," he said, his voice warm. "I'm Father Noah Henry," I replied, surprised at how nervous I suddenly felt. "Not so elusive, just busy," he nodded, still holding my gaze. "Everyone's busy these days, but it's good to make time for what matters, isn't it?" I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and managed to smile. As we walked to the car, my mother mentioned how wonderful the new priest was how he had breathed fresh life into the congregation. I listened silently, wondering why the brief interaction had left me so unsettled. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to church each Sunday. I told myself it was for my parents, especially my father, whose recovery was slow but steady, but I knew there was more to it. Something about Father Noah's sermons resonated with me in a way I hadn't experienced before. He spoke less about sin and judgment, and more about passion and understanding. His interpretation of Scripture emphasized love above all else, and I found myself clinging to those words, desperate for any sign that there might be a place for me in this faith. After all, 3 months after my return to church, I began staying after services to help with community outreach programs. It started as a way to make my parents happy. They were delighted by my renewed involvement, but soon became something I genuinely looked forward to. We organized food drives, visited elderly parishioners, and renovated the church's small library. Father Noah was often present during these activities, working alongside volunteers, his sleeves rolled up and his clerical collar occasionally loosened. During these afternoons, we would sometimes talk casual conversations, at first about books. He was an avid reader, music, the town's history. He had a way of listening that made you feel as though your words mattered, as though he was absorbing every syllable. Eventually, our conversations deepened. He told me about his journey to priesthood, which hadn't been as straightforward as I'd assumed. He'd studied literature in college, spent 2 years teaching English in South America, and only then felt called to seminary. "I believe God leads us on winding paths sometimes," he said one afternoon as we sorted donated books. The Detours have purpose even when we can't see it. I wondered if he could see the purpose perp in my detours, if he could possibly understand the path I was on. There were moments when I almost told him, when the truth pressed against my lips with such force that I had to physically turn away to keep it contained, but I always held back, fearful of what might happen if I shattered this fragile connection we'd formed until last weekend, when everything changed again. I had been helping Father Noah with some administrative work in the church office. It was late afternoon and most of the volunteers had gone home. My parents had left earlier, my father still tiring easily after his health scare. We were alone in the small room adjacent to the sanctuary, the setting sun streaming through stained glass and painting the worn wooden desk between us in jeweled colors. Father Noah was talking about an upcoming youth retreat, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was caught in the same loop it had been circling for weeks, wondering what he would say if he knew the truth about me, if his compassion extended to someone like me, if his interpretation of faith had room for the person I was. Henry, his voice broke through my thoughts. You seem a million miles away. I blinked, focusing on his concerned expression. Sorry, I was just thinking about something troubling. From the look on your face, he set down his pen. Would you like to talk about it? The question hung in the air between us. I had spent so long hiding, deflecting, pretending. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Father Noah's expression softened. Sometimes the things we find hardest to say are the ones we most need to voice. I looked down at my hands, tracing the wood grain of the desk with my fingertip. I'm afraid of what you'll think, of what it means for me here. Whatever it is, Henry, this is a place of acceptance, of God's love, not judgment. I took a deep breath, then another. The words were there, had always been there, waiting to be freed. I'm gay, I said. Finally, the declaration hanging in the stillness of the church office. I've known for years, but I've never really said it out loud to anyone connected to this place, not even my parents. I couldn't look at him. The silence stretched, and with each passing second I felt my heart rate accelerate. Had I made a terrible mistake? Would he ask me to leave, quote scripture at me, tell my parents? Then I felt his hand cover mine on the desk, a brief reassuring touch. Thank you for trusting me with that, Henry, he said, his voice steady and warm. That must have been difficult to say, especially here. I looked up, surprised to find no condemnation in his eyes, only a gentle understanding. You're not disappointed, I managed. Father Noah shook his head. God created you exactly as you are, Henry. Your sexual orientation is part of that creation, not a mistake or a flaw. I stared at him, feeling something unravel inside me, a knot of tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of me. But the church I began, the church has not always been a welcoming place for LGBTQ+ individuals, he acknowledged, and different denominations and individual priests hold different views, but I believe in a God of love and inclusion. I believe Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves without qualification. Tears pricked at my eyes. Unexpected and overwhelming. I stopped coming to church because I thought there wasn't a place for me here. There is always a place for you here, he said firmly, and I'm sorry if the church ever made you feel otherwise. We talked for hours after that. The sun set completely, and we turned on the small lamp on the desk, its circle of light creating an intimate space for my long-suppressed words to finally find air. I told him about realizing I was gay in high school, about the crushing fear that had accompanied that knowledge, about dates I'd gone on in neighboring towns where no one would recognize me, about the loneliness of hiding such an essential part of myself from my family and community. Father Noah listened with unwavering attention. He shared stories of other LGBTQ+ Christians he had counseled, of the theological perspectives that affirmed their identities, of his own journey toward more inclusive understanding of faith. He admitted that not everyone in the church shared his views, but emphasized that this didn't make his interpretation less valid. The greatest commandment is to love, he reminded me, not to judge, not to exclude, but to love. When we finally realized how late it had grown, he insisted on walking me to my car. The night air was cool, and the church grounds were quiet and shadowed as we Reached my vehicle, he placed a hand on my shoulder. I'm glad you told me, Henry. And I hope you'll continue to feel welcome here. I nodded, unable to fully express the relief flooding through me. Thank you for listening, for understanding. His hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment before he stepped. Back same time next Saturday for the food pantry setup. I'll be here, I promised. On the drive home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The fear wasn't gone entirely. I still hadn't told my parents, still worried about others in the congregation, but sharing my truth with Father Noah and being met with acceptance had created a crack in the wall I'd built around myself. The week that followed was transformative. I moved through my days with a new sense of possibility. At the library where I worked, I found myself suggesting LGBTQ plus inclusive literature for our next display without the usual anxiety. I smiled more easily at strangers, laughed more readily with friends. The burden of secrecy, though not entirely lifted, had shifted enough to allow me to breathe more freely. When Saturday arrived, I was eager to return to the church. The food pantry preparation was scheduled for the afternoon, but I arrived early, hoping for another opportunity to talk with Father Noah before the other volunteers appeared. I found him in the parish hall, already arranging tables and shelving units. You're early, he said, smiling as I entered, eager to sort canned goods. Something like that, I replied, moving to help him with a particularly unwieldy Actually, I wanted to thank you again for last week, for how you responded when I came out to you. He stopped, turning to face me fully. You don't need to thank me for treating you with the basic dignity you deserve, Henry. Maybe not, but it meant a lot to me anyway. I hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said about God creating me as I am. I want to believe that. What's stopping you? He asked gently. I considered the question. A lifetime of messages suggesting otherwise. I suppose it's hard to unlearn that overnight. Father Noah nodded thoughtfully. Faith is a journey, not a destination. Questioning and re-examining what you've been taught is part of developing a mature spirituality. We continued, setting up as we talked, our conversation moving between theology and personal experience. Father Noah shared more about his own faith journey, including a period of doubt during seminary when he questioned his calling. I think God values authenticity above certainty, he said as we finished arranging the last table. Being honest about your questions and struggles is more important than having all the answers. Before I could respond, the door opened and other volunteers began arriving. The intimate space of our conversation dissolved as we turned to greet them and explain the day's tasks. But throughout the afternoon, I was aware of Father Noah's presence in a way I hadn't been before. His easy laugh as he joked with elderly parishioners, his patience with the children who had come to help, the quiet authority with which he directed the operation when the work was done and most volunteers had departed. I lingered, helping to clean up the last few items. Father Noah approached as I was wiping down a table. Would you like to get coffee? He asked, surprising me. There's a small place a few blocks from here. I could use the caffeine after today, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation. The invitation caught me off guard, but I nodded. I'd like that. 20 minutes later, we were settled at a corner table in a cozy cafe I'd passed countless times but never entered. Father Noah had changed out of his clerical collar into a simple blue sweater that brought out the color of his eyes. Without the formal attire, he looked younger, more approachable. It was strange seeing him this way, like encountering a teacher outside school. For the first time, I come here often to write my sermons, he said, wrapping his hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. The owners don't mind if I sit for hours with just one drink. What's your sermon about tomorrow? I asked, genuinely curious. He smiled slightly. Authenticity and faith. It was already planned before our conversation last week, but it feels particularly relevant now. Will you? I hesitated, uncertain how to phrase my concern. Mention you, he finished. No, of course not. Not everything you've shared with me is confidential, Henry. I relaxed slightly. I appreciate that I'm not ready for everyone to know yet. Coming out is a personal process, he affirmed. Each person has to determine their own timeline and approach. No one should rush you or force you. Our conversation flowed easily from there. We discovered Aired shared interests in classic literature and folk music, he told me. About growing up in a small town in the Midwest similar in many ways to our coastal community, I shared stories about my work at the library and my dream of someday writing a novel. The afternoon light faded to evening as we talked, and I was surprised when I glanced at my watch to see how much time had passed. I should probably go, I said reluctantly. My parents will wonder where I am. Father Noah nodded, though I thought I detected a similar reluctance in his expression. Of course, thank you for joining me. As we walked out of the cafe, a light rain had begun to fall. Father Noah insisted on walking me to my car, which I'd left in the church parking lot. We shared his umbrella, walking close together to stay dry. The proximity felt both comforting and unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. At my car, I turned to thank him again for the coffee and conversation. The words died on my lips as I noticed the way he was looking at me with an intensity that hadn't been there before, or perhaps that I hadn't allowed myself to recognize. Henry, he said softly, I want you to know how much I valued our conversations, how much I valued getting to know you. There was something in his voice that made my heart beat faster. I valued them too, I replied, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. He seemed on the verge of saying something more, then appeared to think better of it. I'll see you tomorrow at service, I nodded, suddenly unable to form words. He smiled, a brief, almost sad gesture, then turned and walked back toward the church, the umbrella bobbing above him in the gentle rain. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to make sense of the strange energy that had arisen between us. Had I imagined it? Was I projecting my own confused feelings onto a man who had simply shown me kindness and acceptance? I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the familiar streets passing by my window. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with fragments of our conversations and images I couldn't quite recall. Upon waking Sunday morning, arrived with clear skies and a knot of anticipation in my stomach, I dressed carefully for church, taking more time than usual to select clothes and style my hair. My mother noticed, commenting that I looked particularly nice. As we drove to the service together, I mumbled something about a new shirt and stared out the window, avoiding her curious gaze. At church, Father Noah was once again in his clerical attire, performing his duties with the same grace and warmth I'd always observed his sermon as he'd mentioned, centered on authenticity and faith, on the importance of bringing one's whole self to a relationship with God rather than presenting a carefully curated version. Though he didn't look at me directly during his address, I felt as though the words were meant specifically for me. After the service, I stood with my parents in the receiving line. When we reached Father Noah, he greeted my parents warmly, inquiring after my father's health and promising to visit them later in the week. When he turned to me, his expression remained professionally friendly, but there was a depth to his eyes that seemed to communicate something private. Good to see you, Henry, he said, clasping my hand. His touch lingered just a moment longer than strictly necessary. Will you be helping with the youth group meeting this afternoon? I hadn't planned to, but I found myself nodding. Yes, I can be there. Wonderful, we'll need all the help we can get. The teenagers are planning their summer service project. As we walked away, my mother expressed surprise that I was volunteering. Yet again, you've become quite involved with the church lately, she observed. It's lovely to see, but don't overextend yourself, dear. I enjoy it, I said simply. It wasn't a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. I returned to the church that afternoon, finding a group of about 15 teenagers gathered in the parish hall with Father Noah and 2 other adult volunteers. The energy was chaotic but positive as the teens debated various service project ideas. Father Noah facilitated with patience, occasionally redirecting when conversations went off track, but mostly allowing the young people to lead the discussion themselves. I helped set out snacks and then sat somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the group, uncertain of my role. Father Noah caught my eye and gestured for me to join him at the front of the room. Everyone, he addressed the group, this is Henry. He works at the town library and has a lot of experience with community service. I thought he might have some insight into local needs. Suddenly, the focus of 15 teenage gazes, I felt a flush creeping up my neck. Yes, well, from what I see at the library, there's definitely a need for educational support in some of the lower income areas of town. Maybe a tutoring or reading program. This suggestion sparked a new round of discussion, and I found myself drawn into the planning process. By the end of the 2-hour meeting, the group had decided on a combination of environmental cleanup and literacy promotion. They would clean up the beach area while also collecting gently used books to create small free libraries in underserved neighborhoods as the teens dispersed. Father Noah approached me. Thank you for your input. They really responded to your ideas. They're good kids, I said. Feeling oddly proud of the project we developed together. Smart and compassionate. Yes, they are. He glanced around to ensure we were alone, then added in a lower voice, could you stay for a bit? I'd like to talk with you. My pulse quickened. Of course. We moved to his office, a small room adjacent to the sanctuary that I'd only glimpsed before. It was modestly furnished, but personal bookshelves lined the walls filled with theological texts but also literature and poetry. A worn leather chair sat behind a simple desk, and photographs of what appeared to be family members were arranged on a side table. Father Noah closed the door behind us, not completely, but enough to provide privacy. He gestured for me to take a seat in one of the chairs facing his desk, but instead of moving behind it himself, he chose the chair beside mine. I feel I need to apologize, he began, his voice earnest. I'm concerned that I may have acted inappropriately yesterday. I frowned, confused at the cafe. I don't understand, he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically nervous. Henry, I value our conversations and your trust in me immensely. As a priest, it's my duty to provide spiritual guidance and support to all parishioners, but I'm also— He paused, seeming to search for words, aware that the dynamic between us has perhaps become complicated. Understanding began to dawn. You mean because I came out to you? Partly that, yes, but also because He hesitated again, then continued with apparent difficulty. I find myself thinking about our conversations more than I should, looking forward to seeing you in a way that goes beyond my role as your priest. My heart was pounding now so loudly I was certain he must hear it. I don't understand what you're saying. Father Noah met my gaze directly. I'm saying that I'm concerned about my own feelings, Henry. As a priest, I have ethical obligations. I shouldn't develop personal attachments that might interfere with my ability to provide pastoral care. Personal attachments, I repeated, the words hanging in the air between us. You mean— I mean that I find myself drawn to you in ways that are not purely pastoral, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, and that is something I need to address within myself, not burden you with. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was telling me. Part of me wanted to reach out to bridge the small distance between our chairs, but another part recoiled at the complexity of what was unfolding. I don't know what to say, I finally managed. You don't need to say anything, he assured me quickly. In fact, I shouldn't have said anything at all. I just felt dishonest continuing our interactions without acknowledging this complication. Is it really a complication? I asked, surprising myself with the boldness of the question. If we both feel the same way— Father Noah's expression tightened. Henry, my position comes with responsibilities, boundaries that exist for good reasons. You came to me in a vulnerable state, sharing something deeply personal. Responding to that with romantic interest would be an abuse of the trust you placed in me. But what if my feelings developed independently? I argued. What if I was drawn to you before I ever confided in you? A flash of something— hope perhaps— crossed his features before he composed himself. Were you— Yes, I admitted. From the first time I heard you speak, there was something about your perspective, your compassion, that resonated with me. My coming out to you wasn't the beginning of my feelings. It was a result of the trust that had already developed between us. Father Noah ran a hand over his face, a gesture of someone wrestling with difficult thoughts. Even if that's true, Henry, there are still complications. I'm still your priest. There's still a power dynamic at play. Then don't be my priest, I suggested impulsively. I can attend a different church for spiritual guidance if that's what's required. He looked genuinely taken aback. You would do that if it meant being able to explore whatever this is between us? Yes, the certainty in My voice surprised even me. Father Noah was silent again, his internal conflict visible in the tension of his shoulders, the slight furrow of his brow. It's not that simple, he finally said, but his tone had softened. My vocation is central to who I am. Any relationship would have to exist alongside that reality, not in place of it. I understand that, I assured him. I'm not asking you to choose between your calling and whatever might develop between us. I'm just asking for a chance to find out if there could be something worth exploring, and if there isn't, he asked quietly, if we discover there's nothing beyond this initial attraction, the damage to your spiritual journey could be significant. I considered this. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Is it one you're willing to take as well? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. Father Noah stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the church grounds now bathed in the golden light of sunset. I remained seated, giving him the space to think, though every fiber of my being wanted to go to him, to bridge the physical distance that seemed to symbolize the emotional chasm we were attempting to cross. I've spent my life in service to God and the church, he said finally, still facing the window. I've never questioned my vocation, never regretted the sacrifices it required until now. He turned, and the raw emotion in his eyes took my breath away. Not because I regret my calling, but because for the first time I'm confronting the possibility that God might be calling me to something additional, something I never anticipated. And what's that? I asked, barely above a whisper, to authenticity. As you pointed out, he replied with a hint of a sad smile, to living truthfully, not just preaching about it. I stood now, moving closer to him but still maintaining a respectful distance. What does that truth look like to you? Noah. It was the first time I'd used his name without the title, and the intimacy of it wasn't lost on either of us. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I think I'd like to find out, carefully, thoughtfully, with full awareness of the complexities involved. My heart raced at his words. That sounds reasonable. Genuine smile touched his lips. Reasonable? Not exactly the most romantic approach, is it? I'll take reasonable over nothing, I replied, returning his smile. We stood there, the evening light painting the office in warm gold, the air between us charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Neither of us seemed to know how to proceed from this tentative agreement. To what? Explore our feelings, begin some kind of relationship. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in weeks the heaviness in my chest had lightened. What now? I asked. Finally, Noah. It was becoming easier to think of him this way. Considered the question. Now I think we proceed with care. I'll speak with my bishop about the situation, seeking guidance without compromising your privacy. You should consider finding spiritual counsel elsewhere, at least temporarily, and perhaps we could spend time together outside the church context, get to know each other as people, not as priest and parishioner. It was methodical, cautious, but I understood the necessity for such boundaries. I'd like that, he nodded, relief evident in his expression. So would I. As I prepared to leave, Noah walked me to the church entrance. At the door he had hesitated, then reached out to squeeze my hand briefly, a gesture that managed to be both chaste and deeply intimate. Thank you for your courage, Henry, he said softly, for coming back, for insisting on honesty. I nodded, unable to find adequate words for all I was feeling. I'll call you tomorrow, I'd like that, he replied, echoing my earlier words with a warmth that stayed with me as I walked to my car. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of getting to know each other outside the context of church. We met for coffee in neighboring towns, walked along the beach during quiet weekday afternoons, and once even attended a symphony performance in the city an hour away. Each encounter deepened my understanding of who Noah was beyond his role as Father Noah. His dry sense of humor, his passion for social justice, his surprising competitiveness when it came to trivia games. True to his word, Noah had spoken with his bishop, a conversation he described as challenging but ultimately supportive. The bishop had advised caution and discretion, but acknowledged that clergy were human and entitled to personal relationships provided they maintained appropriate professional boundaries. I had begun attending a different church in a neighboring town for Sunday services, though the arrangement felt temporary in my mind. My parents noticed my absence from Our local church, of course. I explained that I was exploring different perspectives on faith, which wasn't entirely untrue. They seemed concerned but supportive, my father commenting that questioning was part of a mature faith journey, unknowingly echoing Noah's words from weeks earlier. As for Noah and me, our relationship progressed slowly, deliberately. Our first kiss happened nearly a month after our conversation in his office on a deserted stretch of beach. As the sun set over the water, it was tentative, gentle, both of us still conscious of the complicated nature of our connection, but it was also a confirmation that what existed between us was real, not just a product of forbidden attraction or spiritual confusion. I think I'm falling in love with you, I told him that evening as we sat on the sand watching the waves, and it terrifies me. He took my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine. It terrifies me too, but I'm beginning to think that some of the most important journeys in life should be a little frightening. It means we're growing, changing, becoming more than we were before. I leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his warmth. Is that what this is? A journey, I believe. So he replied, his voice thoughtful, one neither of us expected to take, but perhaps one we were meant to find. The future remained uncertain. There would be difficult conversations ahead with my parents, with the congregation, with ourselves. Noah's vocation would always be a central part of his identity and reconciling that with our relationship would require ongoing negotiation and understanding. But as we sat there on the beach, the setting sun painting the sky in colors that rivaled the church's stained glass, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I had spent so long believing that I had to choose between my faith and my identity, between the comfort of religious community and